Lila's world seemed ordinary to those outside her home, a bright, shy girl with hard-working parents. But behind closed doors, a dark secret festered. Her father, Hassan, betrayed the role of protector, turning her childhood into a nightmare of fear and silence. As her body began to reveal the unspeakable truth through a pregnancy she couldn't hide, Lila's carefully guarded secret threatened to unravel, setting the stage for a battle that would expose betrayal, test resilience, and seek justice in a world quick to judge and slow to listen. The dusty roads of Kiboko village stretched endlessly, lined with sprawling baobab trees that whispered secrets to the wind. Lila loved those trees. She'd sit under them after school, sketching their twisting branches in her small notebook. She dreamed of becoming an artist one day, painting stories that no words could tell. At just 9 years old, her world was simple, colored by the laughter of her friends, the warmth of her mother, and the stern but protective presence of her father. Lila's mother, Fatima, was a pillar of strength. She worked tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. She would rise at dawn to sell fresh bread at the market and return late at night from her cleaning job at a local school. Fatima's absence often left Lila in the care of her father, Hassan, a man respected in the community for his discipline and strong work ethic. Yet behind his charm lay a temper that Lila had learned to navigate with careful obedience. Hassan was strict, enforcing rules with the weight of his authority. He rarely smiled, his stern eyes always scanning for mistakes. Still, there were moments when Lila felt his affection, like the time he helped her mend her torn school uniform or taught her how to tie her shoelaces. Those moments, though rare, made her believe he loved her in his own way. One evening, Lila sat at the kitchen table, her pencil moving slowly across the page. She was working on her homework, but her mind kept drifting to the baobab tree she'd seen earlier that day. Its branches had looked like outstretched arms, as if it were trying to hug the sky. "What are you drawing?" Hassan's deep voice startled her. She hadn't heard him enter. "Nothing, Baba," she said quickly, flipping the page to cover her sketch. He frowned but said nothing. Instead, he walked to the stove, where Fatima had left a pot of stew simmering before heading out to her evening shift. The house was quiet, except for the clink of the spoon as Hassan stirred the pot. "Come here, Lila," he said after a moment. She hesitated, her small hands clutching her pencil. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he replied, his tone softer now. "I just want to talk." Relieved, Lila set down her pencil and approached him. He knelt to her level, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You're a good girl, Lila," he said. "You listen to your father, and that makes me proud." She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at his rare praise. "Thank you, Baba." But as he pulled her into a hug, something felt off. His grip lingered too long, and the warmth she felt turned to unease. She didn't know why, but a part of her wanted to pull away. Yet she stayed still, not wanting to upset him. That was the first time Lila felt a fracture in her world, a crack so small she almost convinced herself it wasn't there. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The feeling of her father's arms around her lingered, unsettling her in a way she couldn't explain. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of crickets chirping outside. Her room was small, just big enough for her wooden bed and a shelf stacked with her school books. Usually it was her safe haven, a place where she could dream about her future. But tonight, it felt unfamiliar, like a space she no longer belonged in. In the days that followed, her father's behavior changed in subtle ways. He began hovering more, watching her as she played or worked on her assignments. His compliments, once rare, became more frequent but carried an odd tone that made her uncomfortable. "You're growing into a beautiful young lady," he told her one evening as she helped him with dinner. The words sounded kind, but the way he said them made her skin crawl. She didn't tell anyone about her discomfort. How could she? Her mother was always busy, coming home late and leaving before sunrise. Lila didn't want to add to her burden, and besides, she wasn't even sure if there was anything to tell. She tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that her father's behavior was normal. Fathers were supposed to love their daughters, weren't they? But the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. One night, it happened. Lila had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at school. The house was quiet, as it always was when her mother worked the night shift. She was drifting off to sleep when she heard her bedroom door creak open. "Papa?" she whispered groggily, sitting up in bed. Hassan stood in the doorway, his tall figure outlined by the dim light from the hallway. "Go back to sleep," he said, his voice calm. Lila lay back down, assuming he was checking on her like he sometimes did, but instead of leaving, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Her heart began to race. "Baba, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting up again. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat on the edge of her bed and reached out to stroke her hair. "You're such a good girl, Lila," he said softly. "You always listen to me." Something in his tone made her stomach twist. She wanted to move away, but her body froze. She could feel the weight of his hand on her shoulder, heavier than it should have been. "Baba," she started, but he cut her off. "Shh, it's okay," he said. "This is our little secret, all right?" The words echoed in her mind, their meaning unclear but terrifying. He leaned closer, and Lila's world shattered. When he finally left her room, Lila lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't move. Her mind was blank, her body numb. She felt like a doll, something lifeless and hollow. The next morning, Hassan acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted her with a smile, asked her how she'd slept, and sent her off to school with a packed lunch. Lila tried to pretend everything was normal too, but inside she was breaking. At school, her teacher noticed her silence. Lila, who was usually attentive and eager to learn, stared blankly at her notebook, her pencil unmoving. "Is everything all right, Lila?" the teacher asked, crouching by her desk. Lila nodded quickly, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely audible. But she wasn't fine. She didn't know how to be fine. That night, Hassan came into her room again. This time she tried to stop him. "Abba, please," she begged, her voice trembling. But he only shushed her, his grip firm and unyielding. "This is for your own good," he said. "You don't want to make Baba angry, do you?" Lila shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't want to make him angry. She didn't want to lose her mother. She didn't want anything bad to happen to her family. So she stayed silent. The abuse continued, becoming a shadow that haunted Lila's every waking moment. She began withdrawing from her friends, isolating herself out of shame and fear. Her grades started to slip, and her once bright eyes became dull and lifeless. Fatima noticed the change but attributed it to the pressures of growing up. "She's just going through a phase," she told herself. "She'll be fine." But Lila wasn't fine. Every night she prayed for the courage to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But every time she thought about it, Hassan's voice echoed in her mind, "No one will believe you. If you tell, I'll hurt your mother." So she stayed silent. Lila's world continued to shrink as the abuse persisted. The days bled into one another, each one marked by fear and silence. Hassan's manipulative words and veiled threats became a constant in her life, and Lila clung to what little normalcy she could find. Her once vivid dreams of becoming an artist began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. One evening, as Lila sat in the corner of the living room working on her math homework, Hassan entered with an unusual air of friendliness. He placed a hand on her shoulder, making her freeze. "How's the homework coming along?" he asked, his voice almost too soft. "It's fine, Baba," she murmured, not meeting his gaze. "Good girl," he said, stroking her hair in a way that made her stomach churn. He lingered, his presence oppressive, before finally walking away. Lila exhaled slowly, relief flooding her as the moment passed. But that relief was short-lived. Hassan's visits to her room became more frequent, and his threats grew darker. One night, as she tried to resist him, he grabbed her wrist tightly and whispered, "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure your mother pays the price. Do you understand me?" Lila nodded through tears, too terrified to speak. She couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to her mother. Hassan's control over her deepened, fueled by her fear and silence. At school, Lila's teacher, Miss Amina, began to notice her students' decline. Lila, once a bright and enthusiastic learner, now avoided eye contact and rarely participated in class discussions. Concerned, Miss Amina called Lila aside after class one day. "Lila, is everything all right at home?" she asked gently. Lila's heart pounded. She wanted to tell Miss Amina the truth, to unburden herself from the secret that was consuming her. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Hassan's threats echoed in her mind. "I'm fine, miss," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired from all the schoolwork." Miss Amina frowned but didn't push further. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here, okay?" Lila nodded, but she knew she couldn't take that risk. What if Hassan found out? What if he followed through on his threats? The weight of her silence grew heavier with each passing day. Fatima's demanding work schedule left her unaware of the storm brewing in her home. She worked long hours, often leaving before dawn and returning late at night. When she was home, she was too exhausted to notice the subtle changes in Lila's behavior. "Lila, why don't you come sit with me?" Fatima suggested one evening, patting the couch beside her. But Lila shook her head, mumbling something about homework and retreating to her room. Fatima sighed, chalking it up to teenage mood swings. The distance between mother and daughter grew, leaving Lila feeling even more isolated. She yearned to tell her mother the truth, but the thought of shattering her mother's world held her back. Instead, she carried the burden alone. One night, after Hassan had left her room, Lila sat on her bed, shaking with silent sobs. She couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the shame, the constant sense of violation, it was too much. She grabbed her notebook and began to write, pouring her pain onto the page in the form of a letter to her mother. "Dear Mama, I need to tell you something, but I'm scared. Baba is not who you think he is." She hesitated, tears smudging the ink. Could she really give this to her mother? What if Hassan found it? What if her mother didn't believe her? The thought of facing that kind of rejection was unbearable. In the end, she tore the letter into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet, her chance at freedom disappearing with the swirling water. The abuse continued, but the cracks in Lila's facade were beginning to show. At school, her grades plummeted, and she began skipping meals. Her once sparkling eyes were now hollow, and her laughter had disappeared entirely. Miss Amina grew increasingly worried, but without concrete evidence, there was little she could do. One day, as Lila walked home from school, she passed by a small community center where a poster caught her eye. It read, "If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, speak up. Help is available." For a brief moment, hope flickered within her. Could she really speak up? Was help truly available? But as quickly as the thought appeared, it was extinguished by fear. Hassan's threats loomed large in her mind, and she walked away, the weight of her secret heavier than ever. Lila's life became a web of fear and silence, each day darker than the last. Her father's control over her tightened, his threats evolving into a constant shadow over her life. As the abuse escalated, so did her isolation, and Lila began to feel trapped in a nightmare with no end. Hassan's threats grew sharper and more explicit. "If you tell anyone, Lila," he said one night after another horrifying encounter, "your mother will lose her job and we'll lose this house. You want us to end up on the streets, don't you?" Lila shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bear the thought of her mother suffering because of her. The guilt, though misplaced, consumed her. The fear Hassan instilled wasn't just about him. He made Lila believe that the world outside their home was just as dangerous. He painted a picture of betrayal, convincing her that no one would believe her. "People will say you made this up. They'll call you a liar and they'll ruin your mother's life," he whispered. Fatima's work had only become more demanding. A new supervisor had increased her hours, and she often came home too exhausted to notice the changes in her daughter. If she did, she chalked them up to teenage angst or stress from school. "Lila, you've been so quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Fatima asked one evening as she prepared dinner. Lila forced a small smile. "I'm just tired, Mama. School has been hard." Fatima nodded sympathetically. "You're growing up so fast, my girl. Soon you'll be a young woman, and all of this will seem like a distant memory." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they only deepened Lila's sense of despair. How could she tell her mother that the person she trusted most was the one destroying her? At school, Lila withdrew further from her classmates. The lively girl who used to laugh and play during lunch breaks now sat alone, staring blankly at her food. Her friends tried to reach out, but she pushed them away, fearing they might sense her secret. "Lila, you've changed," her friend Aisha said one day. "You never talk to us anymore. Did we do something wrong?" Lila shook her head. "No, Aisha, I'm just be busy." But Aisha wasn't convinced. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything?" Lila nodded but said nothing. She wanted to believe she could confide in Aisha, but the fear of Hassan's retaliation was too great. She was alone, and she knew it. Lila began having nightmares, dark, suffocating dreams where she screamed for help, but no one came. Each morning she woke up drenched in sweat, her chest tight with dread. Her body began to show the physical toll of her suffering. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, and her skin grew pale. At school, Miss Amina pulled her aside again. "Lila, I'm worried about you," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You're not yourself. Is something happening at home?" Lila's eyes darted to the floor. She wanted to tell her teacher everything, to finally release the burden she carried. But her son's threats echoed in her mind, drowning out her courage. "No, miss," she said softly. "I'm just tired." M&M's Amena sighed, clearly unconvinced. "If you ever need help, Lila, please remember that I'm here. You don't have to go through anything alone." One night, Hassan's threats took a new chilling form. After another assault, he sat on the edge of Lila's bed and spoke with an eerie calmness. "If you ever tell your mother, I'll make sure she doesn't live to hear the rest of the story," he said. His voice was low, but the menace in his words was unmistakable. Lila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always feared for herself, but now her mother's life was at stake. She knew Hassan was capable of violence. He had proven that time and time again. The thought of him harming Fatima was enough to silence her completely. From that moment on, Lila withdrew even further. She avoided eye contact with her father, barely spoke to her mother, and stopped participating in class altogether. She existed in a state of numbness, a shell of the person she once was. One evening, as Lila walked home from school, she passed the community center again. The poster she had seen before was still there. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, speak up. Help is available. She stopped, her eyes lingering on the words. For a moment she considered walking inside, asking for help, but the thought of what Hassan might do if he found out stopped her. She turned away, tears streaming down her face. That night, she prayed for strength, for a way out of the darkness that had consumed her life. She didn't know how much longer she could endure, but she held on to the faint hope that one day someone would hear her silent cries for help. Lila's life continued in silence, but her body began to betray the secret she carried. As the weeks turned into months, subtle changes began to appear, changes that even she didn't fully understand. She felt different, heavier, and more tired than usual. But it wasn't until her school uniform became uncomfortably tight around her stomach that she began to realize something was seriously wrong. One morning, as Lila dressed for school, she noticed her skirt didn't fit the way it used to. It clung tightly to her waist, making her feel uncomfortable and exposed. She tugged at the waistband, her fingers trembling. Maybe I've just been eating too much, she thought, though she knew that couldn't be true. She barely ate these days, her appetite dulled by fear and anxiety. Pushing the thought aside, she forced the skirt on and rushed to school, hoping no one would notice. But the signs became harder to ignore. She started feeling nauseous in the mornings, sometimes rushing to the bathroom to vomit before heading to class. Her energy drained quickly, and her once flat stomach began to curve outward, subtle but undeniable. During a biology lesson one afternoon, the teacher discussed reproduction and pregnancy. Lila felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as the words washed over her. She looked down at her growing belly and felt a wave of panic. Could I be? She wondered, her heart pounding. A week later, during lunch, Lila's friend Aisha approached her. Lila, are you feeling okay? You've been looking different, she said hesitantly, her eyes glancing at Lila's midsection. Lila felt her cheeks flush. I'm fine, she mumbled, pulling her sweater tighter around her body. But Aisha's words stuck with her. Unable to ignore the possibility any longer, Lila made her way to the local clinic after school. She waited nervously in the small, crowded waiting room, her heart racing as she imagined what the doctor might say. When her name was called, she felt as though she were walking to her doom. The nurse was kind but direct. After a brief examination and a few questions, she confirmed what Lila had feared most. She was pregnant. Lila stared at her in stunned silence, her world spinning out of control. Are you sure? She whispered. The nurse nodded. You're about 4 months along, she said gently. Do you have someone you can talk to? Your mother, perhaps. Lila shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know how to explain any of this to her mother. She didn't even know how to explain it to herself. When Lila returned home that evening, she found Hassan in the living room, watching television. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling. Baba, she said softly. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. What is it? I went to the clinic today, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. They said I'm pregnant. For a moment there was silence. Then Hassan's face twisted in rage. He stood up abruptly, towering over her. "You're lying," he spat. "I'm not," she insisted, her voice breaking. "They told me." Before she could finish, he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her close. "If you tell anyone that I'm the father, I'll make sure you and your mother regret it," he hissed. "Do you understand me?" Lila nodded, too terrified to speak. He released her roughly and she stumbled backward, her body trembling with fear. As Lila's pregnancy progressed, her symptoms became harder to hide. Fatima began noticing the changes in her daughter. Her growing belly, her frequent nausea, her constant exhaustion. "Lila, what's going on with you?" Fatima asked one evening, her tone sharp with concern. "You've been acting strange for months now." Lila shook her head, avoiding her mother's gaze. "I'm fine, Mama, just tired." But Fatima wasn't convinced. That night, as Lila slept, Fatima crept into her room and found the clothes Lila had hidden. Shirts and skirts stretched out from trying to cover her growing belly. The truth began to dawn on her, and she felt a wave of fear and anger. The next morning, Fatima confronted her daughter. "Lila, are you pregnant?" she demanded. Lila froze, her eyes filling with tears. She wanted to deny it, to pretend it wasn't true, but the look in her mother's eyes broke her resolve. She nodded slowly, her whole body shaking. "Who is responsible for this?" Fatima asked, her voice trembling with rage. "Who did this to you?" Lila couldn't speak. She looked down at the floor, her tears falling silently. But when her mother repeated the question, her voice rising in desperation, Lila whispered the one word she had been too afraid to say. "Baba." Fatima staggered backward as if she had been struck. "What did you just say?" she whispered. "Baba," Lila repeated, her voice barely audible. It was Baba. For a moment, Fatima couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what her daughter had just said. When the truth finally sank in, she erupted in fury. Hassan, hearing the commotion, entered the room. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "You monster!" Fatima screamed, lunging at him. "How could you do this to our daughter?" Hassan denied everything, calling Lila a liar and accusing Fatima of being hysterical. But Fatima refused to back down. She grabbed her phone and called a trusted friend who helped her contact the authorities. That night, Fatima and Lila fled the house and sought refuge at a friend's home. Lila felt a mixture of relief and terror. She was finally free from Hassan's grip, but she knew the battle was far from over. When the police arrived to arrest Hassan, he maintained his innocence, claiming Lila had fabricated the story to cover up a relationship with someone else. But Fatima stood by her daughter, vowing to fight for justice. The truth of what had happened to Lila came out like a storm, shattering the fragile peace of their lives and sending ripples through the community. For Lila, the revelation marked both an end and a beginning, a chance to step out of the shadows of her abuse, even as she faced the daunting weight of its consequences. The night the police arrived at their small home, Hassan was seated in his usual spot in the living room, watching the evening news. When the officers knocked on the door, he opened it with a calm expression, feigning ignorance. "We're here to arrest you under suspicion of sexual abuse," one of the officers announced. Hassan froze, his calm demeanor cracking. "What nonsense is this?" he demanded. "Who has been spreading these lies?" But the officers had come prepared. Lila had already provided a statement, with Fatima standing by her side as she tearfully recounted her father's abuse. The medical examination conducted at the clinic confirmed her pregnancy, and all the evidence pointed to Hassan. As they led him out of the house in handcuffs, he turned to Fatima and Lila, his eyes blazing with anger. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Mark my words." Lila shivered under his gaze, but Fatima stood firm. "The only regret I have is not protecting my daughter sooner," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. News of the arrest spread quickly through Kiboko village, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit community. Hassan had always been seen as a respected figure, a hard-working man and a devoted father. The idea that he could commit such a heinous act left many in disbelief. Some rallied around Lila and Fatima, offering their support and condemning Hassan's actions. "You're so brave for speaking out," one neighbor told Lila. "We're all behind you." But others were not as kind. Whispers of doubt and blame filled the air. "Are we sure she's telling the truth?" one woman said to another at the market. "What if she's making it up to cover for something else?" Fatima overheard these comments on her way to work one morning. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding with rage. Turning to the women, she said, "You weren't there. You didn't see what my daughter went through. So unless you have something helpful to say, keep your mouth shut." The women looked away, embarrassed, but the damage was done. The stigma surrounding the situation was a constant reminder of how far they had to go in their fight for justice. The trial began several weeks later, and it was one of the most difficult experiences of Lila's life. She had to stand before a room full of strangers and recount the horrors she had endured, reliving every painful moment. Her hands trembled as she spoke, but she refused to let her fear silence her. Fatima sat in the courtroom every day, her presence a source of strength for Lila. When Hassan's lawyer tried to discredit Lila's testimony, painting her as a confused teenager who had fabricated the story, Fatima rose to her feet, her voice trembling with anger. "My daughter is not a liar," she said, her words ringing through the courtroom. "She is a survivor, and I will stand by her no matter what." The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence, including the results of the medical examination and the psychological evaluation that confirmed the trauma Lila had endured. Slowly, the tide began to turn. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Hassan was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his reputation in the community forever tarnished. For Lila and Fatima, it was a moment of relief, though it came with a bittersweet realization no amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done. As they left the courthouse, reporters and neighbors surrounded them, bombarding them with questions and comments. Fatima shielded Lila as best she could, guiding her to the safety of a waiting car. That night, for the first time in months, Lila slept without fear. Hassan's trial sparked a much-needed conversation in Kiboko village about abuse and the importance of believing survivors. Miss Amina, who had always suspected something was wrong, partnered with a local organization to start workshops on child protection and abuse awareness. Schools began implementing programs to teach students about their rights and how to seek help if they felt unsafe. Lila's story became a rallying cry for change. While not everyone in the community supported her, those who did became fierce advocates for her cause. As Lila's pregnancy progressed, she faced a new set of challenges. At just 14, she was terrified of becoming a mother. She worried about how she would provide for her child, how the world would see her, and whether she could ever truly move past her trauma. But Fatima stood by her side, offering unwavering support. "We'll get through this together," she promised. "You're not alone." When Lila gave birth to a baby girl, she named her Hope, a symbol of resilience and a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is light to be found. Fatima and Lila decided to leave Kiboko village and moved to a nearby town where they could start fresh. Lila enrolled in a new school, determined to finish her education and build a better future for herself and her daughter. Fatima found work at a community center where she began advocating for other victims of abuse. Though the scars of their past would never fully fade, Lila and Fatima found strength in each other. Together, they began to heal, turning their pain into purpose and their silence into a voice that would inspire others to speak out. The journey after the trial was one of healing, rebuilding, and finding purpose in the pain. Lila and Fatima's lives were irrevocably changed, but their resilience became the foundation for a new beginning. The aftermath was not without its struggles, but it also offered moments of hope and transformation. After moving to a nearby town, Lila and Fatima found themselves in an unfamiliar but promising environment. The quiet, distant village they had left behind felt like a chapter they were ready to close. Fatima secured a job at a local community center, working with victims of domestic abuse and advocating for stronger child protection laws. Her work became a lifeline, not just for others but for herself as well. Helping other women and children gave her a sense of purpose, a way to channel her anger and guilt into something meaningful. Lila enrolled in a new school where she tried to settle into a routine. It wasn't easy. Her past clung to her like a shadow, and the stares from classmates, some sympathetic, others judgmental, reminded her of the story she could never escape. But she kept going, determined to give her daughter hope, a better future. Caring for a newborn at such a young age was overwhelming. Lila often felt unprepared and inadequate, especially during the sleepless nights when hope cried endlessly, refusing to be comforted. There were moments when the weight of it all, the abuse, the pregnancy, the judgment, felt unbearable. But Fatima was always there, offering her support and wisdom. "You're doing your best, and that's enough," she would say, cradling hope so Lila could get some rest. Despite the challenges, hope became a source of light in Lila's life. Her innocent laughter and tiny hands gave Lila a reason to keep fighting. "You're my miracle," Lila would whisper to her daughter during quiet moments. "You're proof that something good can come from something so terrible." Both Lila and Fatima began attending therapy sessions provided by the community center. For Lila, it was the first time she had the space to process her trauma and speak openly about her feelings. At first, it was difficult. The words felt heavy and revisiting the past was painful. But over time, therapy became a place of safety and growth. Through therapy, Lila learned to let go of the guilt she carried. What happened to you was not your fault, her therapist reminded her again and again until she began to believe it. She also learned how to set boundaries, rebuild her self-esteem, and find strength in her story. Fatima struggled with her own guilt for not recognizing the signs earlier. "I should have protected her," she often said during sessions. But with time, she realized that blaming herself wouldn't change the past. Instead, she focused on being the best support system for Lila moving forward. Lila's story caught the attention of a local journalist who approached her and Fatima about sharing their experiences. At first, Lila was hesitant. She wasn't sure she wanted her story to be public, afraid of the judgment and pity it might bring. But after much thought, she realized that speaking out could help others who were suffering in silence. With Fatima by her side, Lila shared her story in an article that was published in a national newspaper. She spoke about the abuse, the fear, the stigma, and the strength it took to break free. The response was overwhelming. Letters and messages poured in from people across the country, many of whom thanked Lila for her bravery and shared their own stories of survival. Inspired by the impact of her words, Lila decided to join her mother in advocacy work. She began speaking at schools and community events, educating children about their rights and encouraging them to speak up if they ever felt unsafe. Her vulnerability and courage resonated with many, and she became a symbol of hope for others. As hope grew, she became a constant reminder of resilience and renewal. Her curiosity and laughter filled the home with warmth, slowly replacing the memories of pain and fear. Lila often found herself marveling at her daughter's innocence, determined to protect it at all costs. "Hope is our second chance," Fatima often said. "She's proof that we can rebuild, no matter how broken we feel." Lila's bond with her daughter deepened over time. Though she struggled with the complexities of being both a survivor and a mother, she found joy in watching hope grow and thrive. Lila worked hard to catch up in school, balancing her studies with her responsibilities as a mother. She dreamed of becoming a counselor or teacher, someone who could guide and support children the way she wished someone had supported her. Fatima continued her work at the community center, becoming a prominent figure in the fight against child abuse. Together, mother and daughter created a new life filled with purpose and healing. Though their journey was far from easy, they learned to find strength in each other and in the small victories of each day. Fatima's practical wisdom and Lila's raw honesty brought attention to the silent epidemic of abuse and the lack of resources for victims in rural areas. Lila's speeches were particularly impactful. At one event, she stood before a room filled with parents, teachers, and policymakers, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was silenced for so long because I thought no one would believe me," she said. "But I've learned that my voice is powerful and it can create change. No child should ever have to go through what I went through." The audience gave her a standing ovation, and several organizations reached out, offering scholarships and mentorship programs to help her pursue her dreams. With the support of a local NGO, Lila was able to continue her education while raising hope. Years later, Lila and Fatima launched a foundation dedicated to supporting survivors of abuse and their families. They named it the Hope Foundation, after the child who had brought light into their lives. The organization provided counseling, legal support, and education programs for children and parents. Through the foundation, they were able to reach countless families, offering resources and support to those who felt voiceless and alone. Lila's story became a beacon of hope for others, proving that healing was possible even in the face of unimaginable pain. On the day of her high school graduation, Lila stood on the stage, holding her diploma with tears in her eyes. Hope sat in the front row with Fatima, clapping excitedly. It was a moment Lila had dreamed of but wasn't sure she'd ever achieve. As she looked out at the crowd, she felt a surge of pride, not just for herself, but for the journey she and her mother had taken together. They had faced darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. In her valedictory speech, Lila shared a message that had become her mantra. "We are not defined by what has been done to us. We are defined by how we rise, how we heal, and how we use our voices to create a better world." As Lila and Fatima continued their work, they saw the ripple effects of their efforts. More survivors came forward, communities began implementing child protection policies, and the stigma surrounding abuse started to fade. Though their scars remained, they wore them as badges of strength. They had turned their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that would protect and empower future generations. Lila often told Hope about their journey, not in a way that would burden her, but to teach her the importance of resilience and compassion. "You come from a line of strong women," she would say, "and you, my darling, are the brightest light of all. Lila's story is one of resilience as she overcame abuse, found justice with her mother's support, and turned her pain into a mission to help others through advocacy and hope. Kindly subscribe, like, and share for more tales like this. See you in my next video. Thanks for watching.